Non-proliferation, which is quite a special subcommittee in the parliamentary life on our earth, because only very few parliaments have a special body where disarmament topics are spoken of. We have this subcommittee as a common subcommittee, and that's important as well, of the Foreign Affairs Committee and of the Defense Committee. So I'm from the Foreign Affairs Committee, but some other members are coming from the Defense Committee, and so the two perspectives on disarmament, the security or defense aspect for arms control, verification, confidence building measures, and the foreign affairs aspect are coming together. We have for this session the title Nuclear Weapons and Europe, and all of us know that we have 4 nuclear powers in Europe. We have other countries, including my own, where American nuclear weapons are in the country. We have a stalemate in arms control talks, at least partially, as a result of the deterioration of the situation in Europe. And we have changing threat perceptions in the last years in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, in the Eastern EU countries, or in the countries of the former Soviet Union. We have still the problem of sub-strategic weapons in Europe. We have the nuclear weapons, the strategic nuclear weapons of at least 2 European countries, or 3, Russia included. We have on all sides, all of the P5 are modernizing their nuclear weapons, so the 4 nuclear powers in Europe as well. We have an interconnection between conventional weapons and conventional arms races or arms controls topics and nuclear weapons. One of the questions which is raised in each discussion with Russians, with Russian governmental people or with parliamentarians is the prompt global strike capability from the United States. We have a securitization of the debate of a European peace order since the annexation of Crimea and since the conflict in eastern Ukraine. So we have one big question from the disarmament point of view, the question: how can we convince people who are feeling threatened by arms that arms control and disarmament can be an important part of working on a conflict solution and to reduce threats from armament and weapons. And the second question, which is connected to this question, is how can we come back to dialogue between East and West, between the nuclear powers in Europe and the non-nuclear powers, and what kind of confidence-building measures are preconditions for disarmament. And I have one example, one positive example, one of the confidence-building measures in the OSCE, which is part of the, well, which was part of the OSCE regime, is the Open Skies Treaty, and this treaty was working and is working in all the conflict situations around Ukraine, and is at the moment as well working in connection to Turkey, at the Turkey-Syrian border. Russia just made an Open Skies survey flight, and the Open Skies Treaty can be, in my opinion, a good example for confidence-building measures in a situation where confidence was deteriorating. So I open up the floor for the video message from Hervé Morin, and Jean-Pierre Collin wants to give us a short introduction.
Thank you, Aline. As I am the PNND director for France, I just would like to introduce the little video message that the former defense ministers and actually Deputy Hervé Morin gave to us. I'm really, really happy because it's the first time an MPs of France decide to really give an important step for PNND. Even if he's not a member of PNND, he supports a lot of actions. And I just would like to remember to you that he was minister on the Sarkozy mandate between 2007 and 2010. And as you know, France realized 210 nuclear tests in Sahara and in Polynesia, and never recognized the humanitarian consequences, and he was aware of that. So he decided to take the lead on these questions and create a law and push a law inside the National Assembly. Even if the law is not perfect, he really decided to take the leadership of that. And now France recognizes that there is some persons, civilian populations, former soldiers, who have some disease because they were the nuclear test. The other point really important is that so now he's an MP, and he really began to think differently about nuclear deterrence. And by differently, I mean he was the first former defense ministers, I will say again, MPs, and who will say inside the National Assembly that we should to think about the nuclear abolitions and to go to the nuclear weapons-free world. And when I was there inside this National Assembly, it was a conference, please trust me, it was like an angel pass in the sky. Nobody's say something, because it was so something unusual for an MPs in the center-right parties. And I would like at least underline that it's not only a thinking for Hervé Morin. He wrote inside this defense program at the point 6 that his political party of the center-right proposed to cancel one of the two legs of the French components, the French Air Force. So he has some different points and thinking really different. And so that's why I can say that we have a new thinking in France. It's not just only the Greens or the Communists that I'm really happy to have their support, but also some different other MPs of different political parties thinks differently and wants to do a new actions about the French nuclear deterrence. So let's see the video, and you have the translation in the same times, and then Emmanuel will complete this video message. Thank you very much for your attention.
So I hope someone. Oh yes.
Nucléaire dans l'espace européen, c'est évident qu'on a tous en tête les nouvelles menaces auxquelles nous sommes confrontés, la menace terroriste, Daesh, et on voit bien que sur des crises comme celle de l'Ukraine, le nucléaire n'a pas sa place.
The translation in English.
Le nucléaire n'a d'ailleurs pas non plus freiné un tant soit peu les Russes dans leur démarche en Crimée ou en Ukraine. En même temps, est-ce qu'on doit considérer que désormais le nucléaire doit être banni de l'espace européen ? Je dis non, s'il n'est banni que dans l'espace européen. Ce qui est évident, c'est que la démarche doit d'abord être une démarche internationale qui conduit à ne pas être naïf. Ne pas être naïf, c'est ne pas désarmer le peu d'armes nucléaires qui nous restent, construit autour de deux pays, la France et le Royaume-Uni, mais au contraire d'engager à travers une politique, une initiative diplomatique européenne, mais faudrait-il encore qu'il y ait une diplomatie européenne ? Le problème, c'est qu'il n'y en a pas. et que nous soyons en mesure d'engager ce débat à l'échelle internationale et de mettre Russes et Américains face à leurs responsabilités. Désarmer seul, certainement pas. Et ensuite, il faut savoir en tirer les conséquences. Les conséquences, c'est qu'il nous faut une armée conventionnelle qui soit autrement construite qu'elle ne l'est aujourd'hui. Parce que si vous décidez d'aller vers un chemin qui est le chemin que nous souhaitons tous pour l'avenir de la planète, qui est un chemin sans nucléaire, il faut que ce soit en même temps un effort conventionnel important. Il faut en quelque sorte que l'arme conventionnelle devienne un facteur de dissuasion, tant le rapport de force deviendrait un rapport de force dans lequel nous sommes suffisamment crédibles. Et donc on a cette double démarche, engager au niveau international le début d'une ère sans nucléaire, et deuxièmement s'interroger sur l'effort militaire que nous devons faire, qui doit être à mon sens plus important dès lors que nous nous engageons dans ce chemin-là. Mais en effet, les relations au sein du continent européen ne sont plus des relations dans lesquelles le nucléaire a sa place, au moins dans une échelle de temps limitée. Mais je me vois mal en même temps défendre auprès de mes compatriotes qu'on va abandonner le nucléaire si les Russes ne l'abandonnent pas. Et par ailleurs, je me vois mal abandonner le nucléaire quand je sais que les risques de prolifération existent de plus en plus compte tenu de l'état de crise dans lequel la planète semble entrer. Donc voilà un peu le schéma dans lequel j'aimerais qu'on se situe. Engagement diplomatique et politique de l'Europe, compte tenu de son passé à l'ennemi.
So, I think the translation is finished. So, the next speaker would be Monsieur Dupuy, Président de l'Institut Prospective et Sécurité en Europe.
Thank you, Mrs. Chair.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mrs. Chair. I'm happen to be president of this think tank, independent think tank, I must say, but I'm also in charge of defense in the same political party as Hervé Morin. As Jean-Marie has kindly mentioned, my political party drafted a program. We were a certain number of experts to work on that program, and putting in emphasis the strategic need, not to add the democratic issue about the question of nuclear and deterrence, which is a very difficult question to tackle in France, because once you open the debate, you are obviously and subsequently described as abolitionists or people who are against the arms. This is exactly what we are not. I have to say, and I will complete what Hervé Morin has mentioned, taking the opportunity to grab what Ward Wilson said. Ward Wilson said he is an abolishonist because he is an idealist. I am not abolitionist, but I tackle the question of nuclear because I am a realist. And I will try to explain why there is less need for these strategic capabilities. As we all, and of course I will tackle the questions of Europe in the second part of my intervention. I must also complete the fact that I was a former advisor to the Secretary of State for Veteran Affairs, so I tackled the human consequences of the nuclear testing, as Jean-Marie said, when we tested our arms in the 1960s, just before the independence, and just slightly after the independence of Algeria. We must not forget that besides each weapon system, besides each defense policy, there are human consequences, human casualties, and of course this has to be taken in huge consideration. When we are speaking in France about this debate, we all come to one obvious for certain persons, but I think not so much obvious, not so much evidence, linked to the question of a budget capability. As is to say that in a cash-strapped agenda, the question of nuclear is very accurate, as some point out, by the end of 2025, 30% of the equipment credits of our defense will be dedicated to nuclear capability or deterrence capability. So I have to say it's not an pertinent and not a legitimate, not a relevant question at all. Once you have said this, you have to tackle the question of why we must have a debate on taking step-by-step measures, confidence building measures, if you have in mind what is the spectrum, what is the architecture of the security as it was forecast 40 years ago in the Helsinki conference. Now tackling all of the questions, but starting by a starting point. And the starting point in France is maybe having a very intelligent thinking about our strategic capabilities. We have two components, two legs, as was mentioned by Jean-Marie. In my political party, we say we can get rid of one of the leg. We can get rid of one of the leg because this leg, by the end of 2019, will be completed. And we will have to start a new agenda by the end of 2019 concerning renovation, and of course, this will occur a certain number of credit necessity. Once said this is also true with the submarine capability. And in a cash strip agenda, do we still have the capability of tackling the renovation of our two components by the year of 2019? I think we will be having a lot of difficulties as I said, the credits the credits dedicated to nuclear by the year of 2016 will be at 10% of the credit equipment, and they will be multiplied by 3 to obtain 30% by the year 2025. Having said this, and this is where I want to start my demonstration about realism and deterrence and realism and nuclear capability, are we still in the same geopolitical horizon? Of course, there has been the change, the shift of strategic thinking by the year 1989, 1990. I do believe that now we are in a new shift in which we have to interrogate our tactical operation capabilities. We have to do this because as we are facing new battle space, more and more virtual, more and more out of the box. We are speaking about soft policy. We are speaking about actors who do not react in the same way our enemies, our opponents have acted starting from 1648, the Westphalia Treaty, where it was very simple. We went to war, we went to peace, state by state. This is no longer accurate, and it is no longer accurate because we are living in a world where three notions have merged: volatility of actors, burdening global security, asymmetry of threats, non-state actors jeopardizing the stability of state ownership, and of course the merging factors of instability. I will just point out some: demography, terrorism, and cyber warfare, just to mention some. And the actuality in France gives us a very accurate momentum to speak about dissuasion. 5 days ago, France was attacked very harshly on what we called deep web, which is the core of internet. And we have the certainty that we do not have the capability, and because we did not, we have a lot of difficulty, let me put it in that way, more diplomatically, a lot of difficulty in defending France cyber capability because we have not sufficient investment in that. And that is to say that I fear that we are facing in France what I call a nuclear hypertrophy. Nuclear hypertrophy by the end of 2025, I've already mentioned it, only 0.8% of the French GDP will be dedicated to defense, which is very far from the 2% which are the NATO standards, and which is very far from the 1.5% of the actual GDP dedicated to security and defense. So this is to say there are too much measures, too much investment based on the renovation of our nuclear capability. other point of view, as some of our actors are becoming political, military, diplomatic actors, I have in mind Japan, which has issued a law which authorizes itself to be more offensive, more proactive in the international agenda, as Germany is also seeing itself as a diplomatic actor. I happen to have served as the political advisor of the French force in Afghanistan. I was co-located with the Germans. They had a strategy, they had means, they had an end state, and this is something we have to have in mind. And as we are working for mutual political common understanding on an economical basis. This was true with the Greek crisis, this was true with the Eurozone crisis, this was true with the Ukraine crisis. Then we have to take in consideration that some of our key actors do not feel the same way and do not have the same horizon, the strategic horizon. Now, let me just focus, and I will finish by saying why it's important for us, my political party as centrist, to put in comparison deterrence and European military capability, which unfortunately has not been yet the case. I would not like to do a lecture, but remind us of two fundamentals of nuclear capability: uncertainty and fulgurance, which is what is the core of the milestone of the French policy concerning nuclear. I resume that: how, where, and what force can be used if we are under attack. This has been, during 50 years, the core of our strategy. Second position is fulgurance, certainty. Certainty to strike, first strike perspective, weak to strong. We do not need to have a lot of nuclear capability. We just have to have one precise strike that can hit. And of course, as we now know, the strategy of France is to strike, control and command areas, not to strike civilian capabilities. And I'm putting this as an emphasis because I want to interrogate myself and the audience to see if that is, to see if that could be accurate with only one of the two legs, and to see if it's accurate, again, alone, as we all know that all of our political, military initiative under the scope of the United Nations resolutions. And of course, as you all know, we do engage defense, military, outside of Europe with our European partners. So the second subject, and I feel the most important to initiate our conference, is to see how being too much focused on nuclear capability sort of anesthetized the essential core of some of, at least my political party's ambition, which is to build a strong CSDP and, of course, to be a global actor, as defense must be at the core of the European project. That is to say, as defense is now seen as a paper of tiger, which is not relevant when we know that 700 million inhabitants have the capability of gathering 23% of the world's commerce, and as a strong actor, 20 Euro operations, may they be civilian, may they be military, may they be military or civilians, have and are a reality. As everyone knows, the Treaty of Lisbon in 2009 made a clear ambition about foreign security external policy, creating the European External Action Service. This was mentioned by Hervé Morin. That is difficult when we do not know precisely who is speaking to whom and who has the capability of speaking to the others. I do think that in maintaining nuclear deterrence is a choice leading us to abolish or to renounce to the capability of building the defense of the Europe. And I will add that choosing the Europe of the defense of Europe, occurs a certain number of initiative and a certain number of reality, and the first reality is to have courage, and to have the courage to put aside the table, renverser la table, as we say in French, and open this debate again, which has not precisely been opened to this extent. General de Gaulle, in a note in 1961, said, "NATO is the defense of Europe by the Americans." we think, as Europeans, that we would prefer to have a European defended by the Europeans and a Europe defended by the Americans. And this also brings out new perspective and must integrate the subject of nuclear deterrence, at least at the European level. May that be at Parliament, may that be at COPs, may that be in NAC, concerning some of the places where this should be discussed. I will continue, not so much because I think I'm already out of time, but to say and to interrogate about the TNP. Does the TNP correspond to the world in which we are living now? Obviously not. This had been said before. We have 17 proliferant countries. The TNP does not give an answer to that. We have the perspective to say that it's very difficult to forbid to merging nations, to forbid to richer countries, to forbid to more prosperous and more influential countries the rules on which we have maintained this very difficult equilibrium of power between non-proliferant, non-deterrent of nuclear weapons and non-deterrent of nuclear weapons. That is to say, is the milestone of our independent defense and vital interest still relevant? That is to say, how can we not consider that some of the actors we are facing do have vital interest, and that this vital interest may be willing to be defended by the same words with the same use that we have defended? What I'm trying to say is that, for example, Iran, when it comes to defending the necessity to have their arms, points out the fact that it's not fair that the old countries have based their strategic capability on a reality, and that the new countries who seem and who consider to be as important, as capable of dealing with global security, do want to have the same rights. So this is very, very dangerous, because it will give the impression that to be a potential important country, you do have to be a nuclear country. And this is very contradictory, and I'm speaking on behalf of French position, when at the same time we're calling for new members of the United Nations Security Council, but we're calling for new countries who do not have the bomb. So on one side, you have countries saying, you are an important country because you still have the bomb, and on the other side, we say, no, it's not important to have the bomb, because it's important to be a global geo-economical power, and this is a contradiction that we will have to tackle. Of course, 70 years of United Nations gives us this year the opportunity to tackle this question. And of course, as Hervé Morin has mentioned, we cannot enter this debate as Frenchmen not considering the fact that we cannot be proactive on this question. It was very clear, Hervé Morin said, the two actors that must engage the debate are United States and Russia. And once this is engaged, then we will, us French and others, be on that agenda as well. Of course, I'm saying this because 90% of the nuclear capability is in the hands of these two countries. That is why here in Prague, 6 years after what Barack Obama said, it's very important to recall and in each international arena what is needed. And let me just finish on that. Peace implies apaisement, conciliation, trust and confidence, as the spokesman, the chairperson said, in order to reduce the threats. Thus, we need conciliation, confidence building, and again, reduction of these threats. Let me finish by saying why, on my point of view, the French perspective is a bit awkward in the debate I've heard this morning. Because, to be honest, one of the major reasons why France is still a bit itchy on the nuclear issue is, of course, because we have a very military lobby, very active. And of course, there is duality. When you build subcontinental missiles, you have the same capability to throw out, to bring in outer space satellites, etc., etc. But I won't take that agenda. It's the agenda of the mystique of the presidential function. One of the biggest, not to say the most important capability that the French president, and is very eager to maintain, is its nuclear capability. This is important when you have a strong president who can say, I'm a strong president, I don't need that, because I have a strong army, I have a stronghold on economy, I am a virtual, I have influence. But when you have a scarce president, a more weak president, I'm not doing politics, but I have to say that this president is a bit weaker than his predecessor, then this is when the danger comes. Because if you have a weak president, then you can use easy tools. And you have this capability of saying, I will not burden my capability because I'm still the president. And as the president has very few capability of showing his power, showing his influence, his capability, I have to say that this fascination of the bomb is also linked to the personality of the function. I'm saying this because the former president was not so itchy about the question. Mitterrand and Jacques Chirac withdrew the third component, as you know, the terrestrial component in 1996, and they did this with very facility. So I will finish by saying that what is very important, and this is why I stand here and why I have accepted to come, as Jean-Marie said, I'm not a green, I'm not an utopist. We are very realistic on our military might and what is still needed in face of, as I mentioned, the vacuum of terror which is facing us. And to tackle that, I think we should make choices. And the time has come to make choices, because there's no more the capability of affording a sort of danseuse, as we say in French, allowing us to have nuclear on one side and strong army on the other. We have to choose. And I have to say, in face of the danger that is facing Europe, I definitely would like to be more engaged in conventional war gaming, in conventional capability, prospective thinking, which allows us to prevent crisis, but again, maybe have a bit realistic point of view, saying that nuclear is no longer affordable for us, weaker states than the emerging nations. Thank you.
So, Mr. Bylica, you want to react and give maybe a more European view of all 28 countries?
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, and good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor for me to be a speaker here at this beautiful palace of the Senate of the Czech Republic. But obviously I was not the one who was invited here, because it was my boss, Federica Mogherini, who is currently the EU High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, one of the Vice Presidents of the European Commission, and the head of the European External Action Service, who unfortunately cannot be with you here today. But I hasten to assure you that she maintains her close links to the PNND. She has a proven track record from her times as Italian Member of Parliament. She drafted and sponsored a resolution back in those days, which was actually passed in the Italian Parliament, supporting the nuclear-free vision of President Obama and supporting the vision, the proposals of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And also in the new job, she was very explicit that issues of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament will be high on her agenda. She made it plain in her parliamentary hearing on the 6th of October 2013, when she had in the European Parliament the hearing on her new job. And she said it very clear that the importance of working towards the fulfillment of disarmament, non-proliferation and export control objectives, calling it actually a matter of our security, not an ideological issue. And she sees non-proliferation and disarmament as a lifelong commitment, one of the great tasks of this generation. She maintains her membership not only in PNND but also in the European Leadership Network for Multilateral Nuclear Disarmament and Non-proliferation, the ELN, in the Group of Eminent Persons, GEM, in support of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And actually, just a couple of weeks ago in New York on the 29th of September, she spoke at the ministerial meeting devoted to the entry into force of the CTBT. As poor ersatz for her present, I'd like to make 3 comments. The first one will be about EU diversity, especially on nuclear matters. Another one will be about EU unity. What, in spite of this diversity, we can actually do jointly at 28 on issues of non-proliferation and disarmament. And in between, I would mention the rather difficult security environment in which we find ourselves. In terms of diversity, this was already mentioned by our chairperson at the beginning of this session, that EU is actually the most diverse of all groups, regional groups which speak in international fora and also inside the NPT treaty in the review process. The European Union, composed of 28 member states, includes both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. States which are legally neutral and states which are members of a military alliance, which defines itself as a nuclear alliance and an alliance which will remain neutral as long as nuclear weapons exist. Some of those states actually take part in so-called nuclear sharing arrangements, have nuclear weapons stationed on its territory. Even in terms of the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, we include states which rely very heavily on nuclear power generation and promote its usage and export, and we have states which have a constitutional prohibition on the usage of nuclear energy. States which are very skeptical or are in the process of phasing out nuclear energy. So if such a diverse group can come up with a united position and a united action, I believe it is a major contribution to agreement in international arena. For example, in the NPT review process, where we were able, for the beginning of this year's NPT review conference, to have a common position on all 3 pillars. The general statement was actually delivered by the High Representative on the 28th of April this year. And we also had 5 agreed EU statements during the review conference, not only in the general debate, but also in the main 3 committees. We provided 3 agreed working papers on the CTBT, on nuclear safety and on nuclear safeguards, organized a couple of side events, and actually a number of other non-EU states aligned themselves with the EU position, and this number actually grew compared to 2015. So we are trying to contribute to the global non-proliferation and disarmament agenda in spite of very difficult security environment, and I would simply mention 2 negative developments which are relevant to these deliberations here on disarmament. One is the emergence of the new aggressive entity in the Middle East, which calls itself the Islamic State, which is a catalyst for terror in the region and beyond, and which, unfortunately, with allegations of deadly usage of chemicals as weapons. We can be happy and congratulate ourselves that also the European Union contributed to the destruction of Syrian chemical weapons per se, but the allegations of usage of chemicals against civilians continue. There is a UN Security Council resolution, 2235, and there is a joint investigative mechanism which actually the European Union is planning to support also financially, so that we can get to the bottom of these allegations. The second negative development, which is relevant to this, is obviously the Russian aggression against Ukraine, the illegal annexation of part of its territory, and the violation of the Budapest Memorandum, with which we, the international community, we lost an important disarmament argument. An important argument because for a number of years one could argue that by abandoning weapons of mass destruction or even nuclear weapons, a state could in fact enhance its security. This was the case of Ukraine, and it was largely based on the Budapest Memoranda of 1994, Ukraine, but also Belarus and Kazakhstan. And unfortunately, we lost this argument with the Russian aggression and violation of the Budapest Memorandum. In spite of this, we are working on non-proliferation and disarmament, also in nuclear domain. The EU position is based on the principle of effective multilateralism. What does it mean? I mean, first of all, we stress the multilateral solutions to those problems. International treaties, mechanisms, control regimes, initiatives, international organizations also, which are enforcing these treaties. We support them both politically and financially. So we deliver, for example, demarches, political, diplomatic demarches, urging countries to ratify, to sign treaties, to ratify, to enter NPT, to ratify CTBT, to sign Arms Trade Treaty, and so on. And in case there is need for capacity building, in case there is need for education, we provide amounts, rather big amounts of money which are available, which go into millions of euros. A very successful recent case of a multilateral solution, a little bit sui generis, is obviously the Iran deal, about which I had the privilege of talking yesterday at the Prague Agenda Conference. So this work is continuing. It also includes work with the civil society, and in this domain I would like to advertise the EU Non-Proliferation Consortium of think tanks, which is created by the EU and financed by the EU, and we have one of the pillars of the consortium here, Professor Müller. And every year we organize with the consortium a big non-proliferation and disarmament conference. This year it is scheduled to be in Brussels on the 11th and 12th of November. Last year we had close to 300 participants, and it's a mix of high-level officials, dozens of disarmament ambassadors, directors of disarmament departments and offices, many academics, and I think parliamentarians would be an excellent, very precious addition to this mix. So I would very much advertise you to look for this, Google and register for the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Conference taking place in Brussels this year on the 11th and 12th of November. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
So, thank you very much. Unfortunately, in the German Bundestag, we have in that week a plenary session week, which makes it difficult for German parliamentarians to take part in a conference in Brussels. But you gave already the, in direction of Harald Müller, the connection between your activities and his activities, and so the floor is yours, Harald.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Before I enter my proper subject, I cannot but take exception to one thing His Excellency former Minister Hervé Morin has said, namely the increasing danger of proliferation. Let me state with the full authority of somebody who has devoted the better part of 40 years as a scholar to non-proliferation, that after the Iranian agreement, nuclear proliferation in the world is at its lowest since the mid-50s. I repeat, we had never since the mid-50s such a low level of proliferation processes as of today, and that means we can relax and think in a calm mood what we do next. Now, I'm here to speak about the project of a nuclear weapon-free zone in Europe. I report basically some of the results of the study which my institute has done for the Austrian and the Swiss foreign ministries. In fact, I am an abolitionist, and so were my co-authors, 2 Germans, an Italian, an Hungarian, and incidentally an Israeli. But nevertheless, I present you the study, and we did the study not in an advocacy mood, but with impartial scholarship, because that was what our funders expected from us. They wanted to learn about the potential merits and shortcomings of such a project, about the opportunities as well as the obstacles and difficulties, and we worked honestly to answer these questions. So the questions I try to address is, does this project make sense? Would it be legal? What could be its substance? What would be its difficulties? And what could be first possible steps? The project of a nuclear weapon-free zone in Europe has a long history. It goes back to the early decades of the Cold War. And at the time, you could distinguish between 3 motivations why governments would propose such a thing, like a nuclear weapon-free zone in Europe. The Soviets made several proposals with the obvious objective to confuse, if not eliminate, NATO's nuclear posture in Europe. Some allies of the Soviet Union, notably Poland under Foreign Minister Rapatsky, followed a slightly different motivation, namely to prevent the deployment of nuclear weapons in their territories or get rid of them, and to reduce the reasons for the presence of Soviet military forces in their territories. And finally, initiatives by neutral countries, notably Sweden, aimed at, as well as they could, to diminish the risks of damage in a nuclear confrontation in Europe, for however lofty this objective might have been given geographical and physical realities. After the end of the Cold War, there were 2 attempts by Belarus to revive the idea in the 90s, but they petered out and ended when President Lukashenko went to power. So why should we discuss it now? First of all, Europe is one of only 5 regions in the world without such a zone. The others are the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, and North America. In addition to that, Europe is a place where nuclear weapons are deployed in several countries, including non-nuclear weapon states like my own. In 2010, the final declaration of the Review Conference of the Non-proliferation Treaty in Action 9 encouraged the establishment of new nuclear weapon-free zone, which means this was an explicit invitation to countries in regions presently without a zone just to explore the possibility. As Jacek Bylica rightly said, the present situation in Europe shows a sort of enhanced nuclear saliency due to the crisis in Ukraine and the ensuing rattling of the nuclear saber by the Russian government, which I take as a distinct sign of weakness rather than as a sign of strength. But nevertheless, it is, of course, driving people east of Germany nervous, and we have to recognize this. Eastern members of NATO no doubt need reassurance because of their enhanced security concerns. In their understanding, extended nuclear deterrence is an indispensable part of such reassurance. And those of us who believe that this is not the case would do better to find ways of reassurance to them which are non-nuclear. My own argument is, and I have made this argument already at several points during the Cold War, that in matters nuclear, counter-cyclical policy, it's much more sensible than pro-cyclical policy. That means if the other side is rattling the nuclear saber, you think yourself very hard how you would turn the screw back to the place we were before, and to get new initiatives at nuclear arms control and disarmament going. And this is all the easier today than it was then, as today we, that is the NATO side of the medal, is by far the stronger party. That might not appear so when you are in Eastern Estonia or Eastern Lithuania, but overall that's the picture. And the picture is going to last. I would also think that the agreement reached on Iran's nuclear program, by the way, in my view, the greatest foreign and security policy success ever for the European Union, that ends for the first time as Union a member of a newly found security organization and even coordinates, that means chairs it, absolutely unseen before. So congratulations to Jacek.
Not to me.
So conveyed to her. So it opens a window of opportunity just to think in a refreshing way. In my view, the main merit, and I say that right now, the main merit of the project of a nuclear weapon-free zone in Europe is its potential to make the whole nuclear issue more salient in Europe. If we are honest to ourselves, European publics are not up in arms because of nuclear weapons. Many of them don't even know that there are these deployments in countries like Germany, Italy, Belgium, or the Netherlands. And if they knew, they probably would want to get rid of them, but they don't know. And it's a silent issue since the early 90s. A zone debate brings the issue close to home, and that's one of the big advantages of it. The main problem in practical and legal terms which this project has is the realistic starting point, which means there are at the moment only very few countries that would commit to such a project. So a zone, when it starts, would look like a patchwork. A few members with gaping holes in between. And the question is this tenable? Is it even legal? As to legality, I have quick consolation for all of you. The UN guidelines on nuclear weapon-free zones speak about states in the region that have to agree to do it. It doesn't speak about the states in the region. There are indeed a few documents on a nuclear weapon-free zones that use the expression the states. And that is the UN resolutions on the Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons, and that is the NPT resolution addressing the Middle East. There you have the language the zones, not in the guidelines, and for good reasons. Secondly, the UN comprehensive study on nuclear weapon-free zones, which is still one of the two main reference documents, says that not continents, not full regions, but also smaller group of states can establish such a zone. And it does not state that these states must share common borders. So the patchwork, as such, is absolutely legal and possible. In fact, we have two precedents of zones that started as a patchwork. And you have to look very, very exactly on the history to discover that. The first one is the first zone ever established, the one in Latin America, the Tlatelolco Treaty. While the Tlatelolco made ratification of the treaty by all states in the region the condition for entry into force, it had a different clause which enabled states to waive this condition. And once the state waived this condition, the zone treaty would become valid and binding for the state. And exactly that happened. So when the Tlatelolco community emerged, it was a patchwork, with some states waiving the condition, some states being very late with ratification, and some states being full parties to the zone a month after it was open for signature. Patchwork. The same with Rarotonga, as Alan, I'm sure, knows quite well. First of all, you have large chunks of the open sea in the Tlatelolco, in the Rarotonga region, terra nullius. That means this is a natural patchwork. Secondly, there are territories belonging to 3 nuclear weapon states, namely France, Britain, and the United States, who had to sign protocols and ratify protocols to accept the same conditions for their territories there as the states in the region has accepted for themselves. It took them 20 years to do so. And there were holes in the patchwork. And thirdly, there is a part of the South Pacific Forum members who entered only later and whose territory is outside of the stated geographical scope of Rarotonga. Nevertheless, they can become members, and some have become members. So, patchwork again. There is precedence, there is legal enablement, so it would be fully legal. What would be the undertakings of parties? We distinguish between basic obligations, non-essential and contested obligations where there might be an opting out option, and non-essential but possibly non-controversial obligations. Basic obligations: no research, development, production, acquisition, possession, transfer, test or use of nuclear weapons, period. Secondly, no stationing of nuclear weapons by third parties on the territory of parties, and no military forces by the parties with a nuclear mission. That, of course, would exclude today's NATO's non-nuclear weapon states who have nuclear weapons on their territory, such as Germany. Thirdly, commitment to a nuclear weapon-free world and to de-emphasizing nuclear weapons in national and collective defense. Non-essential opting out options would be no nuclear weapons in territorial waters, no transit of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapon-free zones that exist are different concerning these obligations. It might be extremely difficult for a couple of potential members to accept these stipulations, so they should be optional. And another one which we have discussed very, very long in the study group and with colleagues, no participation in any nuclear planning, which would basically concern all NATO nuclear weapon states who are all members of NATO's nuclear planning group. And the reason why we were divided on the issue is that some of us said, look, that means complicity in the intention to nuclear warfare. And the others said, look, the nuclear planning group is also an arena in which one can fight for nuclear arms control and disarmament, as countries like Canada, Norway, and at times also Germany have tried to do. So it is a sort of ambivalent forum, and we leave that just open. Non-essential, essential, but possibly non-controversial obligations, toughest nuclear and radiological safety and security standards, full-scope safeguards, and the additional protocol to the safeguards agreement for all nuclear exports and for all members of the zone. Favor to proliferation-resistant technologies in civilian nuclear energy use in those countries who want to use it. No use of highly enriched uranium in the whole zone. Obstacles and problems, very short and easy. First of all, NATO membership is a possible showstopper. It is not a necessary showstopper, because we must all recall that NATO is not by treaty a nuclear weapons alliance, but by political and strategic decision. Nothing obliges nuclear weapon states to say yes to nuclear deterrence. And they can say, well, We want to be defended, we want to join the collective defense, but we don't want to have nuclear weapons for that. And there are, of course, NATO states who do not admit nuclear weapons on their territory, Denmark, Norway, and Spain, which is very often overlooked. NATO's nuclear weapon states plus Russia will be a political obstacle, and we can expect quite a bit of pressure on countries who want to join, and quite a bit of dissuading efforts by partner countries like France or Great Britain. The Ukraine factor I have already alluded to. And there is also this alien out-of-the-box factor with this project. It seems so far from realization. It confronts traditional concepts of security, not only nuclear deterrence, but also the presently more and more popular idea about a nuclear ban treaty. Is there a contradiction? Is there a competition between these projects? One has to see. And it's a political outlier. It appears to be connected to the old days of the Cold War, and I think proponents would have to take a very hard effort to prove its use and utility right now. First steps. I said already, all project strategies have to start from the assumption that at the beginning there would only be a handful of promoters. These initiators would have to ensure supra-partisan support at home for the long haul. That's not so easy, but it would be a condition to push it forward. They would also have to work as closely as they can with supportive parts of civil society. And civil society would have to decide whether they want to go a double approach strategy, the nuclear ban treaty on the one hand, and regional approaches on the other hand, or whether they want to focus on one of the two. There would be no regional organization that would be the natural forum for pushing forward, as we have had it in the Tlatelolco area, we had it in the Rarotonga area, and we had it, of course, in the Bangkok Treaty area with the ASEAN. The OSCE is a mixture of nuclear weapon state, nuclear weapons allies, and non-nuclear weapon states. One could use the OSCE as a forum for debate, but it's not the body that would be the natural forum to promote this. The support of the United Nations General Assembly would have to be extremely carefully prepared. And before the promoters would ask for a supportive resolution, they would have to make sure that they got the necessary two-thirds majority for it. That will be several years' work, I'm quite sure. How would one negotiate such a thing? We envisage a combination of closed shop, such as the Arab League did in preparation for a text for a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, and the Ottawa process, where you had like-minded countries at the core who opened up for everyone willing to join the negotiations. And a combination of that appears to us the most promising venue for negotiating such a zone treaty for Europe. The process must and should be supported by a series of track 2 events where one could sort out the harder problems before they are put to a formal negotiation. Finally, in the end, there would be a treaty text, and there would be a few countries committing to it, and then there would be continuous promotion activities with the hope that the number of members would be increased. To conclude, the project has a lot of merits, notably its position as being directed against a global trend of stagnating nuclear disarmament, and as an opportunity for non-nuclear weapon states in Europe to demonstrate their political will to delegitimate nuclear weapons. In a minimalist shape, as a long-haul endeavor, and with realistic expectations about its patchwork structure and incremental character, then it's closer to realism than one might think. It is legitimate in terms of the NPT, Article 6 is clear that nuclear disarmament is everybody's business, not just the business of nuclear weapon states. Article 7 recognizes the value of zones and of, as mentioned, the 2010 final document, Action 9. It also provides a safety net should the NPT ever fail, because the obligations of the zone, including verification, would stay. It bears a risk to evoke resistance, notably from nuclear weapon states, but that's the fate of all who work for nuclear disarmament, so be it. Working for such a zone is as much in the sovereign right of its promoters as choosing an alliance with a nuclear deterrence component. We in NATO are always very quick to point to the right to choose one's alliance freely, but of course Switzerland or Austria or Ireland are as much in their own sovereign right to do the contrary. There is no reason to believe that a zone project would influence negatively efforts by the nuclear weapon states to pursue their own disarmament agenda, if they do that at all. And the project has a big advantage of political saliency and the potential to stimulate public and media debate and to create momentum. The key issue in the end is whether the promoters are willing to invest the necessary political capital to make the project fly when they compare the risks and benefits of this approach and to calculate the negative reactions of nuclear weapon states. So the formula for the success in the end is one single word: courage. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Harald Müller. Now, Ellen Ware starts the discussion with the report from the workshop, Role of Europe in Nuclear Disarmament.
Thank you very much, Ute. I'm going to be very brief because I think it'll be much more productive for us to have questions and comments with the panel. So I'll just mention the key themes and initiatives in the workshop. We had a 2-hour workshop on Wednesday, which was a combination of academics, policy analysts, parliamentarians, and a couple of, I think, from civil society, non-governmental organisations. I say 4 key things that we discussed during the workshop. One was the European institutions, which have a role, or could have a role, in nuclear disarmament, including the European Union, the OSCE, NATO, and the parliamentary bodies related to these, such as the European Parliament, the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE, the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO, and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. The second thing was looking at variations of cooperation. There are some areas where it's really valuable and useful to have the European countries working as a whole. There's a common European statement to, for example, the NPT review conferences or preparatory meetings, to the UN General Assembly, European engagement in negotiations such as the Iran negotiations. There will be others where bringing together the diverse opinions from the different countries would hold back some important initiatives or progress. And so subgroupings could be very useful, such as the Nordic group, which played a very positive role in the NPT review conference this year. And there are some initiatives which could be taken by individual states or patchwork states, the European Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, establishing as a patchwork, or national measures, national abolition measures, national legislation to advance nuclear disarmament. So in looking at Europe, not just to look at Europe as one, which is important, but also to look at the different aspects, the different groupings and different countries in Europe and what roles they can play. We looked at a few themes and types of initiatives. One of those was the humanitarian dimension and what sort of follow-up is possible in Europe. Is the ban treaty something that's possible, or would it be more likely to be a ban on use of nuclear weapons or no first use? as like a response to the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons that's more likely to be able to get some progress amongst the European countries. So in that sort of flowed into the idea of reducing the role of nuclear weapons and what different ways there could be. I mentioned no first use, non-use, or the European nuclear weapon-free zone. Establishing a nuclear weapon-free zone is also a way of reducing the role. And that is also an aspect of relationship to cooperative security and the relationship of cooperative security mechanisms. And in fact, the example of the European Union as a way of bringing the negotiation of conflicts between countries within the Union, or the resolution of conflicts through the international legal mechanisms instead of war is a very good example. That's one of the reasons why the European Union got the Nobel Peace Prize. Some may disagree with that, others agree with it, but the reason for that was it was a model of the peaceful resolution of conflict between European countries, and that is also related to the idea of reducing or eliminating the role of nuclear weapons. And I think the last theme was how to engage with the nuclear weapon states. There are a couple within the zone, within Europe, but we're also wanting to look at how to engage the other nuclear weapon states as well. There are a few different ideas on more positive type of engagement, looking at what they might be ready to do now, like verification, for example. The United States launched a verification initiative that a number of the other nuclear weapon states are participating in. The idea of looking within verification also at the idea of irreversibility, and maybe there's ways of engaging with France on that, because they have got a good track record on irreversibility when they do take steps. So maybe that's a way to start the process. And also looking at the role of Euratom, which I think has a unique experience of monitoring dual-use facilities and might be able to contribute something. There are other verification initiatives also, like the UK-Norway initiative, that might feed in. So I think those were some of the key themes. But also on the nuclear weapon states, that's sort of more the softly engagement. We also looked at the other side of how to put more pressure on the nuclear weapon states, and there was some discussion of the case that the Marshall Islands has lodged in the International Court of Justice on the nuclear disarmed obligation, and whether some European states could come in and support the Marshall Islands to ensure that there's a more successful outcome to the case, and that whatever comes out from the case, the decision from the court, is followed up and implemented. Because it's not just about whatever the decision will be made by the court, it's in the follow-up to that. So those were the key themes. I think that's enough to give you a bit of a flavour of the workshop that we had, and hopefully that'll give a few more ideas for questions and comments in the discussion period. Thank you.
So, thank you, Alan. We have time for a few short questions before the coffee break. The first one is here, and you have to come to the microphone so that everybody can. Yes, and you are the second one.
My question is for Monsieur Dupuy and also for Harald Müller, and it's that the UK and France have developed more and more joint military strategies, and I was just wondering, given the level of spend that you were talking about that will be nuclear by during the next decade, whether you see that as a hindrance to further talks about downscaling the importance of nuclear, or whether you think it will be helpful that those two powers will be working together.
So, the second question was up there, and then the third here.
Thank you. I have a point and two short questions. My point is to pick up on Professor Müller's mention of the OSCE. I just wanted to share with everybody that at the most recent Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, PNND organized a side event that looked at the proposal for a nuclear weapon-free zone in Europe, but it also discussed Mongolia's very unique single-state nuclear weapon-free zone. And we noticed that among the parliamentarians of the OSCE countries, there's a lot of interest in the zone, but also in this unique single-state nuclear weapon-free zone policy of Mongolia. And this is also where my two questions are related. They're to you, Professor Müller, but I invite any of the panelists to comment. You mentioned Action Point 9 of the 2010 NPT Review Conference Action Plan, which of course encourages states to establish zones. Do you interpret that also to encourage states to establish single-state zones, which of course has been recognized by a UN study from 1974 and has subsequently been done by Mongolia? My second question is, if it turns out that political will or appetite among the patchwork states, the kind of usual suspects, if you will, seems lacking, do you think there's any value in some of these states pursuing national nuclear-free prohibition legislation as an interim measure to hopefully the establishment of a zone later on? Thank you very much.
I'm a doctor von Herald from Costa Rica. Es un comentario que quería hacerle al señor Harald Müller.
It's just a comment that she wants to do to Harald Müller.
Quería hablarle acerca de Tlatelolco. Este tratado nació ante una necesidad que vio América Latina en 1962.
She wants to mention the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which was born out of necessity in 1962 in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Lo que pasó fue que un avión se extravió, tomó fotos en Cuba y se encontró que había misiles rusos en Cuba.
What happened was that a plane got lost. It took some pictures of Cuba and it realized that Cuba had some missiles in it.
Entonces había que hacer algo, ¿verdad? Venía la Guerra Fría a todo meter, como dicen, ¿verdad?
So, you know, there had to be something done. It was in the middle of the Cold War.
Ecuador fue el primer país que emergió y empezó a hacer algo, un tratado. Junto se unió Brasil, luego México, y empezó el Tratado de Tlatelolco para hacer una prevención de liberar a América Latina de las armas nucleares.
So Ecuador stepped in. Later, Brazil also stepped in, and ¿cuál fue el tercero?
México.
And then Mexico, and that's how the Treaty of Tlatelolco was beginning to be born, because they wanted to free the whole zone, that means Latin America and Caribbean, from nuclear weapons.
Así que ustedes se pueden imaginar, yo era una niña, y pueden imaginarse el temor que teníamos. No teníamos tecnología, no había televisión, no había teléfono, pero todos sentíamos esa presencia en Cuba.
So you can imagine, as I was a little girl, the fear I was in. I mean, there was no technology like today. There was no television, no phone. There was nothing. And there was just this horrible pressure from Cuba.
Así que las naciones se unieron y como dice la señora baronesa Müller, que los países y los parlamentarios deben de hablar y unirse. Esa es una de mis recomendaciones para que podamos estar al tanto de las necesidades que ocurren en el mundo.
So this is an example of how parliamentarians and governments got together and tried to achieve same goal, even though, and I'm stepping in this part, even though all the countries are very different from each other. But now what my mom continued to say, as it's exactly like what Baroness Müller said. I mean, parliamentarians should be able to interact, to communicate, and to achieve a goal in spite of their differences.
En estos tiempos, la señora Gioconda Ubeda, que fue la secretaria general, activó el Tratado de Tlatelolco y logró que todos los países pudieran al fin firmar en América Latina este tratado.
So the Secretary General, Ms. Ubeda, she's from Opanal. She was able to make all the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean sign this treaty in el 69.
No, en 62. Sí, en el 62.
Yeah, it began in the 62 and it was finalized in 69.
Entonces ustedes pueden darse cuenta de que este tratado nació ante una necesidad inminente que existía en nuestros países de América Latina y el Caribe.
So this is just to make you notice that there was a very big imminent necessity of our countries at that moment, and that we needed, or we had the feeling that we needed to do something to make an action about it.
Muchas gracias.
So that was a nice statement to encourage us to stay active, and as everybody seems to want one short question, but then we have to have coffee break, I think, for each of us.
Thank you very much. Já bych se chtěla zeptat především pana Müllera, zda jsou již konkrétní kroky v té tvorbě bezjaderné zóny nebo v úvaze o bezjaderné zóně v Evropě.
So I give now the word in verse order. Harald Müller is the first one. He had most of the questions as well, and then short comments from the two others.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think that the Parliamentarian Assembly of the OSCE is the best place to address the issue in the OSCE. What I said about my skepticism of making the OSCE the organization in which the zone would grow related to the governmental level, the executive level. But of course, among the parliamentarians, it's a completely different matter. And I think the Assembly can and should be used to discuss this project. As for the single-state self-declared zones, we should recognize that in a way Austria is already in such a position, because the Austrian constitution makes Austria non-nuclear, both in civilian and in military terms. And still Austria is probably the country with the greatest interest to push the zone idea at the same time. And I would always make the point, if there is more than one country, in Europe which subscribes to the idea, those two or three should create the zone. Because the saliency, the public interest, the media controversy would be so much higher as if you have another constitution which basically is somewhere and does not attract the same attention. Finally, let me thank the gentlelady from Costa Rica for her comment, and let me make two remarks here. First of all, as a peace researcher, I've always admired your country. From being in the eye of the storm, in a region of violent turmoil, keeping to democracy, keeping to peace, and not having an army. It is something that would deserve the Peace Nobel Prize year by year, to be frank. Secondly, let me just give you back my own memory of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because I remember the day when it ended. I was a 13-year-old boy, and I was with my father in the football stadium of Frankfurt, watching a match between Frankfurt and Nuremberg. It was the last day of the crisis, but we didn't know it. When the crowd was approaching the stadium, there was a leaden silence. And you could see the faces full of fear. And everybody had his transistor radio with him. 5 minutes before the match started, there was a roar, as if 10 goals had scored at once. And that was a moment when through the radio the message came that the Soviets and the Americans had agreed to end it. When we went home, my father told me he had firmly believed that this was the last match he and I would ever see. Now, the experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis happened to me in the very early phase of my political awareness development. And it was a deep imprint. And the fact that I ended up as a peace researcher specialized on nuclear issue has to do with that very experience. So it's not only the Tlatelolco Treaty, but also my own brain that was stimulated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jacek, Bylica?
Yes, thank you. I don't think there was a specific question addressed to me, but I'd like to make a point about this importance of learning from experience, from one region to another, from one zone to another. For example, the mechanism created in Latin America in the form of ABAC, and also the inspections, for example, on transparency measures between Brazil and Argentina, is something that has been studied and is being studied by those who are working on the WMD-free zone in the Middle East. I spoke to one of the participants in the break, for example, about the workshop which we in the EU organized for diplomats from the Middle East, from both Arab states and Israel, telling them about the experience from, also in the CSC context, of negotiating transparency and confidence-building measures and arms control agreements in Europe. Experiences which could be useful for the Middle East. So this, I think there is a great potential also through the parliamentary channels of actually learning from one region to the other, and through the parliamentary assemblies, for example. Thank you.
So you have the last word for this session.
Thank you, Mrs. Chair. Absolutely. France and Great Britain represent 40% of the United Nations Security Council. That's one fact. There's been two momentums, 1998, Saint-Malo, November 2010, Lancaster House Treaty, where precisely the question was, are we going to engage mutually at the same pace with the same dedication to avoid disequilibrium between conventional power and deterrence capability? 10 priority of Saint-Malo, of the Lancaster House, were very clear. We have to work for the complex weapons of tomorrow, which do not include nuclear weapons. Miniaturization of warfare, virtualization of the battle space. One of the key aspects of Lancaster House was working on resilient individual collective capabilities on cyber. This was the core of the negotiation. I have to say it was not implemented with the same ambition, both for domestic reasons in Great Britain and both for political reasons in France. But the ambition was there. So you're absolutely right. And that leads me to the essential part of what we're treating today. It's about political courage and as well as political momentum. When you do not have two leaders who have the same ambition, it's very difficult for one to stand and to bring the others to follow him. If he does not have this capability of bridging everyone together. So it's very difficult, and this is also true in the Middle East, this is true in other parts of the globe. So it's quite essential that we work on leadership. It's quite essential that we work on the next leadership. This was a very interesting discussion we have with the young leaderships, because they're going to arrive at the same level of power. I will give you an example. As I'm working in Africa, I'm very Afro-optimistic, not for the reasons why everyone says Africa is important, 10% growth, well, 6 to 10% growth, but because in the next decades, the leaders who will come to power will have the same age, will have the same vision of the world, will have been in enhanced in a very intercultural way. And this is also true with the leadership on the security agenda. And this is why it's so much important that we have think tanks liaising together. This is so much important that we respond to the grants of the defense defense agency together. I personally, my institute is working in Brussels with other European institutes, not to have a narrow francophone vision of security. Again, France and Great Britain represent 40% of the defense spending of the European Union, but that's not why it's important that we are engaged with other actors. So I think it's very important to have this double vision. There is a momentum. We have to grasp that momentum. We tied that with Great Britain. I'm quite sure we'll be enhancing new perspective as the Tervuren, for example, agreements with our partners from Belgium, for example. And I'm quite sure what is needed is leaders who stand courageously. Hervé Morin is one of them, but there are others in France as elsewhere, and who say it's not ideological, it's not budget constraint, it's just pragmatism. We are facing more and more danger. The danger will be more and more subtle. We have to be less asymmetric to that and be maybe dissymmetric and respond with a lot of rapidity, intelligence, and let's say fluidity, which is the contrary of what we have with the nuclear capability. It's obvious that if we have nuclear, the security, let's say, let me put it in two phrases and I will finish, Mrs. Chair. During 50 years, it was very obvious and very, let's say, less intellectual engaging to say there's no need to work on security because we have this nuclear equilibrium. Nuclear equilibrium cannot fight against ISIS. Nuclear equilibrium cannot forbid areas of the world to be shattered down. And nuclear equilibrium is, of course, not the response, because if we say that, then all the big countries will become and want to become nuclear. Have in mind that, for example, when Brazil wanted to enter the game of the big players, or when Saudi Arabia, or when South Africa wanted to become members of the United Nations, what they started to do is to have a nuclear program, saying we're doing the same thing that you have done 40 and 50 years. If we go on that pace, then we'll have a United Nations Security Council with 10 or 15 nuclear possessors. And I think this is what I think we should have the contrary. Not to disarm, but I'm not an abolitionist, I'm an evolutionist. And since I'm an evolutionist, things take time. And this is why we're starting this debate in France. Maybe we could have started it way before, but let's take the occasion of grasping it, because it is opening, and it is not only between opponents and defenders, it's people who try to say, well, there's a medium range to that, and then we have to discuss intelligently. This is what we're doing today.
All right, thank you very much to all the panelists and to the audience for listening and contributing. And now the good news is that we have at least 22 to 25 minutes of coffee break. And we restart at 3:40, I think.